Yep. Today we have to do more identity. In our last lab, we went and enabled Amazon Identity Center, or AWS Identity Center. This used to be called single sign-on, and we went through all the details about federation and single sign-on. This week, the lab is going to be more straightforward. What we're going to do is we're going to finish our setup of Identity Center so that you can log in as that administrative user and you'll have admin access to your accounts. In the process, we're going to explore the primitives of Identity Center. And what I mean by primitives, I've used that term before. These are the fundamental building blocks that we need to understand in order to use a particular service. Not a lot of background lecture today. We've already talked about SSO. We've talked about federation. In previous labs, we've talked about authentication and authorization. And again, just a quick reminder, what we're doing with Identity Center, the way we have it configured for this lab, is that you authenticate to Identity Center directly. We're not using an external identity provider. Identity Center itself is the identity provider. Then we created our user and we put our user in an administrator's group. But you'll notice we didn't assign any IAM permissions yet because that's what we're going to do today. And the terminology in Identity Center is a little bit different. And so we just have to spend a few minutes going over that. So let's jump in and I'm going to switch over to the whiteboard and talk through this. Where we are right now with what we've set up with Identity Center is we have our IAM user, and in my case, it's the rmogull user. And we created a group, and a user can have many groups, but for our purposes, we just have our first administrators group. And because my handwriting's so terrible, I'm going to just leave it at admin. But that group doesn't have access to anything. If I go over all of this, there's no access into any of the accounts yet. So to do that, we need to learn a couple of primitives. The first one is a permission set. A permission set is a grouping of IAM policies. By default, you can have 10. It can be either a pre-built role policy within Identity Center. It can be your own managed policy, or you can do an inline policy. Generally, you're going to want to use a managed policy or the built-in Identity Center ones. So we have our permission sets and we have our groups. We've got this piece here and we have this piece here. We also have our accounts. We have two accounts currently. We have our management account and what we're calling our security audit account. Shouldn't use SA. Anybody remember some of the Microsoft default usernames? Yeah, for databases. Well, anyway. What we have to do now is connect everything together. So our process is going to be, let's find a color here that I haven't used yet. I haven't used red completely. What we have to do is we're going to first create our permission set. We are going to assign an IAM policy to that permission set. Then to gain access to an account, we assign the permission set to an account and the group to the account. So it's a combination of the permission set plus the group plus the account. So that's that magic combination. Sorry if there's thumps. My pen's hitting the microphone here as we do this. I only record once, people. That's what you get for free. So it's that combination of that permission set, the group, and the account. It's the union of all of those that gives you as an individual access. Now, a couple of things. You could assign a permission set to an individual user. We're not going to do that today. The other piece is that you can actually assign multiple permission sets. We're going to end up doing that pretty quickly. In our lab today, we just have the single permission set that we're working with, but you could assign multiple permission sets. Now, the way this presents to the actual user is when I go ahead and I log in. So if I do my login, I'm going to see on a screen, I'm going to have a listing of accounts. So let's say account 1, account 2, account 3. And let me scroll this down a little bit so you can see what I'm doing here. And then for each of those accounts, let's say I have 3 roles here that I could use, 3 permission sets. It's going to be role 1, 2, 3. And that's the trick. A permission set, when you assign it, make these connections here. When you assign a permission set to an account, it creates an IAM role. And that IAM role has a special name designated for the permission sets. It's actually a reserved name. We'll take a look at that in the account. So it's just like our assume role operations that we did before. You can create multiple roles. And in this case, when you create a permission set and you assign it to an account, that will create those roles for you. And then when a user logs into Identity Center, they get to pick which role they want to use for that session. And we're going to see all of this in action pretty quickly. So instead of the diagrams, let me go ahead and put this down. A little bit of summary here, and then we'll reinforce this with the lab. A permission set is a set of IAM policies that can be assigned to a user or a group in AWS Identity Center. And then you assign that user, that group, and that permission set to AWS accounts. This is what creates that federation. That creates a role in each of those accounts. And the user picks the role they want to use, and then that establishes that role for that session. You can even put in timeouts and other restrictions and everything else. So it's just a way of being able to collect those policies together up in Identity Center and then have those automatically build out roles and accounts. And that's the magic. And that's why Identity Center works as a bridge from an identity provider to the relying party, which is the individual IAM accounts. It's that bridge because it translates that user and or that group to the sets of permissions they have for an individual account. So you can go from outside AWS to inside AWS. Again, we're doing it all in AWS. All right, let's just go ahead and set this up. It's going to take a few minutes. We're going to give ourselves administrative access to everything. Okay, I'm logged into my account, and as before, I'm still using that administrative IAM user we created way back in like lab number 2. We're going to get back to using, soon we're going to start using our Identity Center user instead of this admin IAM user. But it is important for right now. We're not there yet, so make sure you're logged in with your regular IAM user. From here, I'm going to go to AWS or IAM Identity Center. You'll notice it flicks past the screen because we set this up last time. And I am in US West Oregon, which is where I went ahead and set this up. We already have our user, which is us, and we have our group, which is the administrator. But now we want to give access to the AWS accounts. And to create this access to the AWS accounts, you're going to have your permission set. So let's just do our permission set. So I'm going to go to permission sets, and I'll create a permission set. We're going to use a predefined one. And in our case, we're going to use administrator access. Again, we are creating the one for us to administer everything within our environment, which is why we're going to just stick with that predefined permission set. Behind the scenes, this permission set will create the AWS administrator access policy. I'm sorry, it won't create it. It will link that administrator access policy to the roles that are created in accounts when we actually grant access to accounts. So that's the key here, is that this is going to be using that administrator access policy, but it could be up to, by default, 10 policies that are attached to it. And you just see a bunch of common roles here, including the security audit role, which we might use later. We probably will use later. All right, let me click next. And we're going to leave the default name, administrator access. Anybody who's working AWS kind of knows what this means. I am going to add, I'll just say full admin, make so our lives easier. Now, here's a couple of settings that we're going to leave at the defaults, but I do want you to understand what they are. The first is the session duration. You can set a session for up to 24 hours. I need to double check my documentation. It might be more than 24 hours. I always leave it at the default of 1 hour. If you're in an organization with a lot of developers or a lot of people that are in the console frequently, it's not a big deal to set that session for 8 hours. That way they're only going to be reprompted once a day. I prefer 1, not a huge deal to set that up if it's going to be a human for up to 8 hours. The next is the relay state. The relay state is where in the AWS console do you want that user dropped into, as opposed to just that front default page. So I'll show you what this looks like. By default, when you log in, you see this page, but you can actually set it so it goes to the EC2 page if that's all that user is doing. So it's just a convenience if you have users with specific job roles that you can actually define them to, when they log in, they're going to be set to that area. All right, and we're not going to work with any tags today. So we have our permission set, full admin access. We left our other defaults in place. We're going to create. Our next step is to give ourselves access to the AWS accounts. Now, we can't set this at the OU level. We actually have to do this a little bit more manually. That's okay. If you want to go list, you can actually just do it really quickly here. So remember, hierarchy, you got to kind of click and open things up. List shows you all of your accounts. And in our case, we're going to give ourselves administrative access to all of our accounts. Let's go ahead. I'm going to just click on that, and we're going to assign users or groups. My group name is administrators. Next, and then we give it the administrator access permission set. That's those three pieces that we talked about before. The group or individual user, but we're using groups today. The permission set, which is the IAM permissions that are assigned, and the account. And the account was the first thing we picked on this list. So this is going to be our review. We're going to give access to 2 accounts, the only 2 we have. We're going to give anybody in the administrators group, which is hopefully just administrators, full administrator access to the 2 accounts that we've selected. Submit. Now, don't leave the page. Stay here. Why? What is this doing? Oh, it did it really quickly. The AWS Organizations and Identity Center actually went into each of those accounts and created an IAM role and then assigned that IAM role the administrator access policy. Let's take a little bit of a cheat, and I'm going to show you what it looks like, and you can look at this yourself. Actually, let's do it the good way. So I'm going to go back to the main screen of Identity Center. And if you recall, we have our AWS Access Portal URL. Let me go ahead and open that up. Now, by opening this up, it's going to create problems if I have an open session. So I'm going to go here. I'm actually going to log out of my admin session. Nope, zoomed in there. Let's sign out. And we'll close that window. Now I've got my rmogull user that I had created last week. I really am curious how many of you have created the rmogull user yourself. And then the password. I'm going to go ahead and pause for a moment just because I've got to pull my password from my password manager. And I'll also be prompted for my multi-factor authentication because we set that up last week. So let's go ahead and do that. Everybody log in. Once you've logged in, you'll see a screen like this, and you'll notice last time it said we didn't have access to anything. Now we do. I'm going to click on those AWS accounts, and it lists all the accounts with their account name, as well as the account ID and some other information with those. Let's go to our security audit account. We haven't really done much with that yet. I clicked on it, and it lists the roles I have access to. These are the permission sets that we just set up. This case, it's just administrator access. I'm going to click on the management console. This is now assuming a role and setting a 1-hour session for that role assumption. I can tell this by going into IAM. Remember, we've not done really anything with this account, but if I click on roles, and I now have AWS reserved SSO administrator access role. That's the one that we just created. It was provisioned when we connected our permission set to this account. If I click on it, it's pretty cool. You see, just like I told you, you have that administrator access policy. Remember, I could have up to 10 policies listed here. And then this is the cool part. If I click on trust relationships, you'll notice that it has set up a new kind of a principle. We've seen kind of that AWS one before. We've seen services ones. In this case, it says federated, and this is the SAML provider. Even internal to AWS, it's setting up a SAML provider, that security assertion markup language that I briefly mentioned before. And we skipped all the details about it, but that's what we've got. The other cool thing is that I can do assume role, but only with SAML, and tag the session. And it'll actually go ahead, and we're not going to see that here, but once we start going through logs, you'll actually see how sessions are tagged, so you can go ahead and track those down. All right, I'm going off script. I'm actually going to see if I can show you that real quickly. But remember, this trust policy is who can assume the role. And this says anybody from that SAML provider, it's pretty powerful, can assume that role. Let me check out CloudTrail. And I'm going to go to US East if I'm not already there, because that's where these IAM events appear. And if I go into event history, you can actually see all the role creation that it set up right here. Now, the problem with going off script is I didn't fully prep for this. What I'm going to do really quickly is I'm going to go ahead and just create something so we have an event that I can show you and you can see what that session looks like. Let's just go in IAM itself. And I'll create a user group. We're not going to use this, and when I'm done with the lab, I'm going to delete it. We'll call it delete me, and I'm going to assign no policies. That's how I can make sure that I'm not creating any kind of a user risk, because I assign no policies. Let's go back over to CloudTrail and into the event history. And we just have to wait a minute for this to show up. So let's do a refresh here because it's not instant when it shows up in CloudTrail. Okay, it took about 5 minutes for the logs to show up, and you'll notice my username comes across. And if I look at this actual API call, it can track me down. You can see that I used that AWS reserved role and that it was the rmogull user. Now remember, that's not my admin user that I created. That's because I logged in as that rmogull user. And in some places, very frequently, you can use like your email or whatever for that individual username. So that is really cool. It gives you great attribution that when somebody signs in through Identity Center or using any other identity provider, the actual name they sign into is part of the API calls that are made so that you can go ahead and actually trace back individual user actions instead of just looking at a generic role. Okay, I blabbed on for too much, made the lab a little longer than I planned, but hopefully that gives you a great idea on how to use Identity Center, how to set it up. We're going to do a lot more with it later, but right now we just wanted to get set up with our first batch of admin users. Have a great week.